Hello and welcome to the Whitehead's sitting room, which I've turned into a very impromptu and amateurish studio. You're really welcome. Thank you for watching. Originally, it was arranged that I would take the service up at Sullington on Palm Sunday evening, and clearly that's not going to happen now. But I already had a few ideas of the sorts of things that I might say, and so we decided we'd put those thoughts down on a video. A few weeks back, Harold and I got together to plan the summer Evensongs, and we did our best to come up with a theme. The one we came up with was Christians in Jail, and Harold suggested it wouldn't be a bad idea for me to kick off talking about the story from the book of the Acts of the Apostles, the story of Paul in prison. And wishing to impress Harold with my immense biblical knowledge, I said to Harold, oh yes, that's the story of Paul in prison with Peter and the earthquake. And Harold shook his head and looked rather disappointed, and I realised that I needed to go home and read that book again, and that's what I did. And straight away I found out that Paul wasn't in prison with Peter. But in my defence, I think it's got something to do with that rhyme that I learnt at school. You know, two little dicky birds sitting on a wall, one called Peter and one called Paul. And I think since that time, those two names have been sort of linked in my brain. When I read Acts again, I realised that there are various prison stories in that book, and in fact I'm going to talk about them all, if I may. And because it's Palm Sunday, I also want to talk about Jesus riding into Jerusalem as well. So that means that I'm covering several stories, and it means that this is going to be quite a long talk, really. I suspect around about 20 minutes or so, much longer than it would have been had we been up in Sullington. But the good news is that you can do something quite remarkable in that you can press the pause button, or indeed the stop button, or the delete button, something you probably wish that you could have done for countless sermons that you've endured over the years. Right, let's think about Paul in prison. And this is the book of Acts 16. As I talk about these stories, I am just going to give you a little bit of a biography about the people in the stories, because it's my earnest hope that there may be people listening who don't normally come to church, who perhaps aren't so knowledgeable about biblical characters as others. So just forgive me if I indulge myself. Paul was in prison. Paul was an amazing man. He had an amazing story. He was a leading Jew, and he had persecuted the new Christians. He'd had them stoned, even executed. But one day he was travelling between Jerusalem and Damascus, and he had a vision, and God spoke to him and essentially said, I want you to become a Christian. And there was an amazing transformation in Paul's life, and he spent the next 10 years studying the faith before he embarked upon 3 long journeys spreading the news about Jesus. And they call those the missionary journeys. And on the first journey he travelled with his friend who was called Barnabas, but in fact they had a bit of a falling out. It's a complicated story, but essentially they ended up going their separate ways. And so on the second journey, Paul had a new companion, a chap who was called Silas. And those two men found themselves in prison. They were in a city called Philippi, which is part of Greece, and they healed a woman. And that really irritated some people who had been exploiting and making money out of this poor woman. And those people who lost money contrived to have Paul and Silas imprisoned. So those two men found themselves being flogged, I'm sure quite hideously, and then imprisoned. And one night they were in prison with their feet in their stocks, and they were awaiting trial, and they were singing hymns, and they were saying prayers, and there was an almighty earthquake, and the stocks fell apart, and they were free. And at this point, Paul and Silas did something quite remarkable, because if you and I were in that situation, having been flogged and then imprisoned, the first thing we would do when freed would be to leg it down the hill. They, however, did not. Now, I'm telling you this story in the wrong order, I'm afraid. This, as I said to you, is Acts 16, and in a minute I'm going to tell you about a previous story, which is in Acts 12. In that story of a jailbreak, the guards were judged as being to blame, and they were all executed. And I guess the word of that story would have spread so that by the time Paul and Silas had the chance to escape from prison, I'm pretty sure that the jailer would have been petrified that he too would face execution. Indeed, in the story, when you read it in the Bible, you'll see that the jailer, when he realised the prisoners were free, he drew his sword to stab himself. But then he realised and was amazed to find that Paul and Silas hadn't run away. They, in fact, were prepared to stay and talk about their faith, and he was so amazed that he was converted that night. He and his family dressed Paul and Silas's wounds, they fed them, and they became Christians and they were baptised. The point that I particularly want to make about this story is that Paul and Silas went the extra mile. Rather than just being released and running away, they thought, how can we praise God for what's happened, for what he's done for us? How can we thank God? What more can we do? And what they did was that they hung around and they praised God and they converted that jailer to Christianity. Now, I'd like to tell you another story. Several stories, in fact, from the same book of the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, and this story is about Peter. So, Peter was one of Jesus' disciples, his followers. He was a fisherman, and we hear a lot about him in the Gospels, the stories about Jesus. And we hear that he was a very enthusiastic character. He was the disciple who tried to walk on water. And as we hear the story coming up to Jesus' crucifixion, we hear a couple more things about him. It was Peter who cut off the servant's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it was the same Peter, poor chap, who on the night of Jesus' trial denied knowing Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed. But Peter was a remarkable and wonderful man, and after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, his return to heaven, he devoted his life to telling people all about Jesus. And in so doing, he greatly irritated the Jews, the Jewish leaders, who didn't like all this ongoing talk of Jesus. They wanted to forget about him, and they wanted the Jews to remain as Jews, not to convert to Christianity. And so Peter found himself in jail, in fact, quite regularly. We read about him being imprisoned in Acts 4 and then released, and we read about him being in prison in Acts 5 and released. But the main time we really hear about, and perhaps the most famous story of Peter's imprisonment, is in Acts 12. Now, I would really like you to read that account before we go on. And if you have time, if you have the energy, it would be really great if you could pick up a Bible and read Acts 12 verses 1 to 18. Or if there isn't a Bible to hand, please just go to any computer and just Google Peter's escape from prison. And you will find yourself reading this very interesting story. So, what I suggest now is that you go and read that, perhaps make yourself a cup of coffee as well, and then we'll come back and have 10 minutes more. Thank you.